Old-timers in Cedar Hollow always said Black Rock Mountain kept its secrets buried deep. 13-year-old Ethan had heard the stories his whole life, but he never believed them until the day he wandered beyond the timberline. His father's accident at the mill had left their family on the edge of ruin, and Ethan climbed higher into the wilderness seeking escape from the weight pressing down on their small cabin. That's when he noticed it, a narrow opening in the rock face, hidden behind a curtain of moss and tangled vines. Behind the stones lay a cave untouched for decades. His flashlight beam fell upon walls covered in strange markings, and at the center, a skeleton clutching a leather satchel to its chest. What secret had this person died protecting? Why had no one found this place before? And what would happen when Ethan brought the truth back down the mountain? Cedar Hollow was the kind of town that time had forgotten, a small cluster of weathered buildings and modest homes tucked into a narrow valley where the Appalachian Mountains rose like ancient giants on every side. The town had been built on timber, and for generations, families had lived and died by the rhythm of the sawmill, the crack of falling trees, and the steady flow of logs down the mountain. Main Street was only 3 blocks long, lined with a general store, a post office, a small church with a white steeple, and Millie's Diner, where the coffee was always hot and the gossip was always fresh. Beyond the town limits, the forest stretched endlessly, a sea of green and shadow that held secrets older than anyone could remember. In one of the small cabins at the edge of this wilderness lived 13-year-old Ethan Cole, a boy with a mop of dark brown hair that perpetually fell across his forehead and serious hazel eyes that seemed to carry a weight far beyond his years. He was not a loud boy or a troublesome one, but rather the kind of child who noticed things, the way the light fell through the pine branches in the early morning, the sound of a particular bird that meant rain was coming, the slight tremor in his mother's voice when she said everything would be all right. He had learned to read the world around him because the world had given him no other choice. His mother, Mary Cole, was a kind woman with gentle hands and a soft voice, but the past 3 months had worn her down to the bone. She worked double shifts at Millie's Diner 6 days a week, leaving before dawn and returning after dark, her feet swollen and her eyes ringed with shadows. She always had a smile for Ethan, always asked about his day, and told him she loved him, but he could see the truth she tried to hide. He saw it in the way she sat at the kitchen table after he was supposed to be asleep, staring at the pile of envelopes with red stamps that read past due and final notice. He saw it in the way she flinched every time the phone rang, bracing herself for another creditor's call. She was drowning, and she was trying to drown quietly so her son would not hear, but Ethan heard. He heard everything. The source of all this misery lay in the back bedroom of their small cabin, where his father, Thomas Cole, spent his days in a fog of pain and silence. Thomas had been a giant of a man, not just in size, but in presence, a foreman at Holloway Timber Mill respected by every man on the crew. He had hands like leather gloves and a voice that could calm a spooked horse or command 100 workers with equal ease. He had taught Ethan to track deer through the woods, to read the weather by the way the leaves turned on their branches, to find his way home by the stars. He had been the foundation of their family, solid and unshakable. Then, 3 months ago, a cable had snapped on a cold Tuesday morning. A log weighing half a ton had swung free and struck Thomas before he could move, shattering his right leg in 4 places. The doctors had done what they could, but they said he might never walk without a cane again, and he would certainly never return to the mill. The medical bills had arrived like an avalanche, burying the family in debt they had no way to pay. The insurance covered only a fraction, and the mill's compensation was a pittance. Now foreclosure notices came weekly, each one more urgent than the last. The bank wanted their house, the hospital wanted their money. And Thomas Cole, the man who had always provided, lay in his bed and stared at the ceiling and said almost nothing at all. Ethan felt the weight of it every single day. He was only 13, but he understood that he was now expected to be strong in ways he had never been asked to be before. He chopped the firewood and carried the water. He did his homework in silence and never complained. He told his mother he was fine when she asked, because she had enough to worry about. But at night, alone in his small room, he felt the walls closing in, the pressure of being the only son in a house that was crumbling, of being asked to hold up a roof that was far too heavy for his young shoulders. He did not know how much longer he could bear it. He only knew that something had to change, or the weight would crush them all. The bedroom at the back of the cabin had become a place Ethan dreaded entering, though he forced himself to go there every day after school. It was a small room with a single window that looked out on the tree line, and it smelled of liniment and sickness and something else, something that reminded Ethan of defeat. His father lay in the iron-framed bed that had belonged to his grandfather, his shattered leg encased in a metal brace that looked like some kind of medieval torture device, pins and rods holding together bones that the doctors said might never fully heal. Thomas Cole had lost weight in the 3 months since the accident, his once powerful frame diminishing until his clothes hung loose on his body, and his face had taken on a gaunt, hollow quality that made him look 20 years older. But it was not the physical transformation that frightened Ethan the most. It was the silence. His father had always been a man of few words, but those words had carried weight and wisdom, and his presence had filled every room he entered. Now he lay in that bed and stared at the ceiling or the wall and said almost nothing at all. The pain medication kept him in a fog, but Ethan suspected that even without the pills, his father would have retreated into this shell of silence. The shame was eating him alive. Thomas Cole had provided for his family since he was 16 years old, had never missed a day of work, had never asked for help from anyone. Now he could not even walk to the bathroom without assistance, and the bills for his care were destroying everything he had spent his life building. Ethan understood this, even though no one had explained it to him. He understood it because he saw it in his father's eyes on the rare occasions when Thomas would look at him, a flicker of something that might have been self-loathing before the gaze slid away. That afternoon, Ethan sat in the chair beside his father's bed and tried again. He talked about the woods, about the things his father had taught him, hoping to find some spark that might bring the old man back. He told him about the deer tracks he had seen near the creek, a doe and 2 fawns moving toward the high meadow. He described the way the wind had shifted from the south, which meant the weather would turn soon, maybe snow coming early this year. He mentioned the red-tailed hawk that had been circling above the ridge all week, hunting the same stretch of forest. These were the things they used to talk about together, the private language of their bond, and Ethan offered them like gifts, like prayers, hoping for any response. His father lay motionless, his eyes open but unfocused, fixed on some point on the far wall that only he could see. After a long silence, Ethan tried a more direct approach. "Dad, maybe when your leg gets better, we could go up to the North Ridge. You always said you'd take me there when I was old enough. I'm old enough now." For a moment, something shifted in Thomas's face, a tremor of emotion that might have been longing or might have been pain. Then he turned his head away, showing Ethan nothing but the back of his skull and the gray-streaked hair that needed cutting. "Not now, son," he said, his voice a raspy whisper. "Just let me rest." Ethan sat there for another few minutes, waiting for something more, but nothing came. Finally, he rose and left the room, closing the door softly behind him, feeling as though he had lost his father a second time. That night, Ethan lay in his own small bed and listened to the sounds of the cabin settling around him. The wind had picked up outside, rattling the window panes and moaning in the eaves, but through it he could hear something else, voices, low and strained, coming from his parents' bedroom. He slipped out of bed and crept down the short hallway, his bare feet silent on the cold wooden floor, until he stood just outside their door. His mother was crying. It was a sound he had heard only a few times in his life, and each time it had felt like the ground opening beneath him. Her voice was thick with tears and exhaustion. "Thomas, we don't have a choice anymore. The bank called again today. They're going to take the house if we can't make the payments. We're 3 months behind." 3 months. She paused, and Ethan could hear her ragged breathing. "Maybe if we sell now, before they foreclose, we can get enough to pay off the medical bills and have something left over. We could rent a place in town, something small. It wouldn't be so bad." She was pleading with him, Ethan realized. She was begging her husband to agree to surrender everything they had, and his father said nothing. The silence stretched out, vast and terrible, more devastating than any words could have been. His mother's crying grew softer, more hopeless, as if she understood that she was alone in this decision, that the man she had married had retreated to a place where she could not reach him. Ethan pressed his back against the wall, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, and felt something break inside him. He could not save his father from the darkness that had swallowed him. He could not earn enough money to pay the bills. He was just a boy, powerless against the forces that were tearing his family apart. But he could not stand here and listen to his mother cry. He could not spend another night in this cabin that had become a tomb. He needed to get out, to go somewhere, anywhere, to find a place where the weight on his chest might lift even for a moment. Tomorrow, he decided. Tomorrow he would go into the mountains, farther than he had ever gone before. He would walk until he could not hear the echoes of his mother's tears or feel the cold silence of his father's despair. He did not know what he would find out there in the ancient forest, but he knew he had to go. He had to do something, or the helplessness would consume him entirely. Ethan woke before dawn, his eyes opening to the gray half-light that crept through his window, and for a moment he lay still, listening to the silence of the cabin. His mother had already left for her early shift at the diner, and his father would sleep for hours yet, lost in the dreamless fog of his medication. The house felt empty in a way that had nothing to do with the absence of people, a hollowness that had seeped into the walls and floors and made every room feel like a place where hope had quietly died. Ethan dressed quickly in the cold, pulling on his warmest flannel shirt, his heavy canvas jacket, and his worn hiking boots that were getting too small but would have to last another season. He moved through the cabin with practiced silence, gathering the things he would need for a long walk in the mountains. From the kitchen, he took a bottle of water and a handful of venison jerky his mother had made last fall when times were better. From the drawer beside his bed, he retrieved his most treasured possession, a pocket knife with a bone handle that his father had given him on his 10th birthday. He remembered that day with painful clarity, the pride in his father's eyes as he placed the knife in Ethan's palm and told him that a man's knife was a tool of survival, a symbol of self-reliance, and that he trusted Ethan to use it wisely. That felt like a lifetime ago, like a memory from someone else's childhood. He added a small flashlight to his pack, and then stood in the kitchen, writing a brief note for his mother in case she came home before he returned. Gone for a hike, back before dark. Love, Ethan. He placed it on the table where she would see it, then slipped out the back door into the cold morning air. The sky was just beginning to lighten in the east, a thin band of pale gold beneath the heavy gray clouds that promised rain or maybe early snow. Ethan pulled his jacket tighter and started walking, his breath pluming in the chill as he crossed the small yard and entered the tree line. The forest swallowed him immediately, the dense pines and bare hardwoods closing around him like a living wall, and he felt something in his chest loosen just slightly. This was where he belonged, where he had always felt most himself, and even now, with everything falling apart, the woods offered a kind of solace that nothing else could. He followed the familiar trail that led up the mountain, passing landmarks that were etched into his memory like pages from a beloved book. First came the old stone bridge that crossed Miller Creek, its mossy rocks fitted together by hands that had turned to dust a century ago. Ethan paused there as he always did, looking down at the dark water rushing beneath, remembering the summer his father had taught him to read the current, to understand where the trout would hold in the cool pools and eddies. 100 yards farther, he passed the spot where he had caught his first fish, a small brook trout with speckled sides that had seemed like a miracle in his 8-year-old hands. His father had helped him release it back into the water, telling him that a true woodsman takes only what he needs and leaves the rest for the mountain. Then came the lightning-split oak, a massive tree that had been struck during a storm when Ethan was 6, its trunk blackened and cleaved but still somehow alive, sending out green branches every spring as if to prove that even the deepest wounds could be survived. He had always loved that tree, had always felt that it was trying to teach him something important, but today he barely glanced at it. Today he did not stop at any of these places. He kept walking, kept climbing, driven by a restless energy that would not let him rest. The trail grew steeper and less defined as he ascended, the undergrowth thicker, the trees older and more gnarled. He was moving beyond the territory he knew, beyond the paths his father had shown him, into a part of the forest that felt different somehow. The air was colder here and damper, and the light that filtered through the canopy had a greenish, subterranean quality that made him feel as though he were walking beneath the surface of a deep lake. The sounds were different too, muffled and distant, as if the mountain were holding its breath. He should have been afraid, he knew. His father had always warned him about going too far alone, about the dangers of the deep woods where a twisted ankle or a sudden storm could turn a simple hike into a fight for survival. But Ethan did not feel afraid. He felt only a desperate need to keep moving, to climb higher, to find some place where the weight of his family's troubles could not follow him. The pain of watching his father disappear into silence, the fear of losing their home, the helplessness of being 13 years old and unable to fix any of it. These things pressed down on him like stones on his chest. And he thought that if he could just get high enough, far enough, he might be able to breathe again. So he pushed on, deeper into the old-growth forest, where the trees were ancient giants with trunks wider than he was tall and roots that gripped the rocky soil like grasping fingers. The trail had vanished entirely now, and he was navigating by instinct, by the slant of the terrain and the position of the pale sun behind the clouds. He did not know exactly where he was going. He only knew that he was not ready to turn back, that somewhere ahead there was something waiting for him, something that would make sense of all this pain. He could feel it in his bones, a pull that was almost magnetic, drawing him upward into the unknown heart of the mountain. And so he climbed on, a small figure moving through the vast and ancient forest, searching for something he could not name but knew he had to find. The forest changed around him without warning, as if he had crossed some invisible boundary into another world entirely. One moment he was walking through the familiar woods of his childhood, and the next he had entered a cathedral of ancient trees that made everything he had known before seem small and young. These were the old-growth giants his father had spoken of in hushed tones, the trees that had been growing on this mountain since before the first settlers arrived in the valley, before the town of Cedar Hollow existed, before anyone had thought to give names to these peaks and hollows. Their trunks were massive, wider than cars, their bark so thick and deeply furrowed it looked like the hide of some prehistoric beast. Their roots erupted from the earth in great muscular coils, creating a maze of woody tentacles that Ethan had to climb over and around. The canopy far above was so dense that it blocked out the sky almost completely, allowing only thin shafts of pale light to penetrate the gloom. The air was different here, colder and heavier, and it carried a smell that Ethan could not identify, something old and organic, like the breath of the mountain itself. His father had warned him about this place many times. "Stay below the timberline," Thomas had always said, his voice carrying an edge that meant he was not to be questioned. "The old growth is no place for a boy alone. There are cliffs and sinkholes and places where a man could fall and never be found." Ethan had always obeyed, had always turned back when the trees began to grow larger and the trails began to fade. But today he did not turn back. Today something was pulling him forward, a feeling he could not explain, as if the mountain itself were calling to him. He pushed on, climbing over the roots and around the massive trunks, his breath coming harder now in the thin, cold air. Strange rock formations began to appear, jutting from the earth at odd angles like broken teeth or the ruins of some ancient structure. They were covered in moss and lichen, their surfaces pocked and weathered by centuries of wind and rain, and they gave the forest an eerie, otherworldly quality that made the hair on the back of Ethan's neck stand up. He felt a prickle of unease moving through him, a primal warning from some deep part of his brain that recognized danger even when his conscious mind could not name it. But he did not stop. He was looking for something, though he could not have said what it was. He only knew that he would recognize it when he found it, and then he saw it. A section of rock face rose before him, perhaps 20 feet high, covered in a thick curtain of moss and tangled vines. At first it looked like any other outcropping in this forest of stone and wood, but something about it caught his eye and held it. The surface was too regular, too flat, as if it had been shaped by hands rather than by the slow, patient work of nature. The vegetation that covered it seemed to be hiding something rather than simply growing where it had found purchase. Ethan approached slowly, his heart beginning to beat faster, a strange excitement building in his chest. He reached out and grasped a handful of the vines and pulled. They came away with a tearing sound, showering him with dead leaves and dirt, revealing the dark stone beneath. He pulled away more, working faster now, his hands growing dirty and scratched, until he had cleared a section large enough to see what lay behind. It was an opening, a narrow wound in the mountain itself, perhaps 3 feet wide and 5 feet tall. The darkness beyond was absolute, seeming to swallow the faint light of the forest completely. Cold air flowed out of it, carrying that same ancient smell but stronger now, mixed with something else, the scent of dust and stillness and time. Ethan stood before the hidden entrance, his pulse pounding in his ears, and understood that he had found what he was looking for. Ethan stood before the dark opening, his feet rooted to the forest floor as if the mountain itself were holding him in place. The entrance gaped before him like a mouth, breathing out cold air that smelled of earth and stone and something older than he could comprehend. Every instinct he possessed screamed at him to turn back, to return to the familiar trails and the safety of the world he knew. His father's warnings echoed in his mind, all those cautions about the dangers of the deep woods, about places where a person could disappear and never be found. But there was something else too, a pull that was stronger than fear, a voice that whispered from the darkness and told him that this was why he had come, that this was what he had been searching for without knowing it. His hand moved to his pocket and found the flashlight, his fingers closing around its familiar weight. He pulled it out and clicked it on, and a beam of pale light cut through the absolute blackness, illuminating rough stone walls that glistened with moisture. He took a breath that tasted of dust and age, and he stepped inside. The passage was narrow, so narrow that he had to turn sideways to fit, his chest and back scraping against the cold stone as he shuffled forward. The darkness pressed in around him, and he had the suffocating sensation of being swallowed, of the mountain closing its mouth behind him. His flashlight beam seemed weak and thin against the weight of all that black, a tiny circle of light in an ocean of shadow. He could hear his own breathing loud in the confined space, could feel his heart hammering against his ribs, could sense the vast tonnage of rock above his head. For a terrible moment he thought the passage would go on forever, growing narrower and narrower until it crushed him entirely. Then, without warning, the walls fell away. Ethan stumbled forward into open space, his flashlight beam suddenly reaching out into a chamber that seemed enormous after the tight squeeze of the tunnel. He swept the light around, trying to get his bearings, and what he saw made him gasp aloud. The walls of the chamber were covered in carvings. Symbols and drawings had been cut into the stone with primitive tools, covering every surface from floor to ceiling in a dense tapestry of images. He saw mountains with jagged peaks, rivers that wound in serpentine curves, strange humanoid figures with elongated limbs and round heads. But most striking was a thick line that ran through many of the drawings, a vein of something that the ancient artists had marked with special emphasis, depicting it running through the heart of the mountain like a river of treasure. The carvings were old, impossibly old, and they spoke of knowledge and secrets that predated the town of Cedar Hollow by centuries or perhaps millennia. The air in the chamber was cold and perfectly still, heavy with dust and the weight of ages. Ethan moved deeper inside, his flashlight trembling in his grip, his eyes wide as he tried to take in everything at once. Then the beam found the center of the chamber, and his breath stopped in his throat. A skeleton lay against the far wall, slumped in a sitting position as if it had simply sat down to rest and never risen again. It was dressed in the rotted remnants of clothing that might once have been a jacket and trousers, the fabric now gray and falling apart. The bones were brown with age, the skull tilted forward, as if in contemplation or prayer. But it was the skeleton's hands that seized Ethan's attention and would not let go. They were wrapped around a leather satchel, clutching it against the bony chest with a grip that had outlasted death itself. Whatever was in that satchel, this person had died protecting it. Ethan stood frozen, staring at the remains, understanding that he had found something that was never meant to be found. For a long moment Ethan could not move, could not breathe, could only stand there with his flashlight beam fixed on the skeleton as if looking away might cause it to rise and reach for him. His heart was hammering so hard he could feel it in his temples, in his throat, in his fingertips where they gripped the flashlight with white-knuckled intensity. He had seen dead animals before, had helped his father field dress deer, and had once found the scattered bones of a bear that had died in the winter, but this was different. This had been a person, a human being with a name and a life and people who had loved him, and he had died here alone in the dark, clutching that satchel as if it were more precious than his own survival. The cave was utterly silent except for the sound of Ethan's breathing, which seemed obscenely loud in that sacred space. Slowly, as if approaching a wounded animal, Ethan moved closer. His footsteps echoed softly on the stone floor, and the beam of his flashlight trembled as he walked, casting jittering shadows on the carved walls. He stopped a few feet from the remains and knelt down, bringing himself to eye level with the empty sockets of the skull. This close he could see details he had missed before, the tarnished metal buttons on what had once been a jacket, a leather belt with a corroded buckle, boots that had cracked and curled as they dried out over the decades. The clothing style was old, from another era entirely, and Ethan understood that this person had been here for a very long time. He felt a sudden wave of sadness wash over him, a grief for this stranger who had died so far from home and comfort. He did not know who this man was or why he had come to this hidden place, but he knew that no one deserved to die alone in the dark. He bowed his head and whispered an apology, his voice barely audible even to himself. He said he was sorry for disturbing this rest, sorry that no one had come sooner, sorry for whatever had happened that led to this lonely end. The words felt inadequate, but they were all he had to offer. Then his eyes moved to the satchel. It was clutched against the skeleton's chest, the bony fingers wrapped around it in a grip that had somehow survived the decay of flesh and sinew. The leather was dark brown, cracked and stiff with age, but it had held together remarkably well in the dry air of the cave. A brass buckle secured the flap, green with corrosion. Ethan reached out, his hand hesitating in the air for a moment, and then he gently began to pry the satchel free. The bones resisted at first, as if even in death their owner was reluctant to give up his burden, and Ethan had to work carefully, respectfully, easing the fingers apart one by one. Finally, the satchel came free, and he sat back on his heels, holding it in his lap. It was heavier than he expected. He unfastened the corroded buckle with difficulty, the metal stiff and reluctant, and folded back the flap. Inside he found a collection of papers, yellowed and brittle with age but still legible. There was a hand-drawn map covered in notations and symbols he did not understand. There was a leather-bound journal, its cover worn smooth by handling. And there were official-looking documents with typed text and stamps and signatures. As he lifted the papers out, something slipped from between them and fell to the cave floor with a soft sound. He picked it up and unfolded it carefully. It was a newspaper clipping, the paper so old and fragile it felt like it might crumble in his fingers. The headline was still readable in the beam of his flashlight, and the words sent a chill down his spine that had nothing to do with the cold air of the cave. The newspaper clipping was brittle beneath his fingers, the paper so old and fragile that Ethan was afraid it might disintegrate at his touch. He unfolded it with exquisite care, holding his breath as the creases opened to reveal the faded newsprint beneath. The headline struck him like a physical blow, the words seeming to pulse in the beam of his flashlight. Local surveyor disappears on Black Rock Mountain, search called off after 2 weeks. The date printed beneath the headline was the 23rd of October 1962, a date from another lifetime. From an era when his grandparents had been young and the world had been a different place entirely. Ethan read the article with growing disbelief, his eyes moving over the faded text as the story unfolded before him. A surveyor named Samuel Whitmore, age 34, had been working for Consolidated Mining Corporation, conducting geological assessments of Black Rock Mountain, when he failed to return from a routine expedition. Search parties had combed the mountain for 2 weeks, but no trace of him had ever been found. His truck had been discovered at a trailhead, his campsite undisturbed, his equipment still neatly organized as if he had simply stepped away for a moment and never returned. The article quoted a company spokesman expressing deep regret, quoted the sheriff saying they had exhausted all leads, quoted a wife named Eleanor pleading for anyone with information to come forward. But no information had come. Samuel Whitmore had walked into the wilderness and vanished as completely as if the mountain had swallowed him whole. Ethan lowered the clipping and looked at the skeleton slumped against the cave wall. His throat was tight, his eyes stinging with sudden emotion. He had found him. After more than 60 years, after all the searches and all the grief and all the unanswered questions, a 13-year-old boy had stumbled upon the remains of Samuel Whitmore in a hidden cave that no one knew existed. He wondered about the wife, Eleanor, wondered if she had spent the rest of her life not knowing what had happened to her husband, wondered if she had eventually given up hope or if she had gone to her own grave still believing he might come home. The weight of it was almost too much to bear, the sadness and the waste and the terrible loneliness of this man's death. With trembling hands, Ethan set the clipping aside and picked up the leather journal. It was smaller than he had expected, perhaps 6 inches by 8, with a cover that had once been a rich brown but had faded to a dull tan over the decades. The leather was worn smooth in places where hands had held it countless times, and there was a strap with a tarnished brass button that held it closed. He unfastened the button and opened the cover, and there on the first page, written in neat, precise script, was a name, Samuel Whitmore. Beneath the name was an address in a town called Ridgemont, and a date, March 1962, presumably when the journal had been started. Ethan turned to the first entry and began to read. The handwriting was small but clear, the words of a careful and methodical man, and as Ethan read, he felt as if Samuel Whitmore were speaking to him directly across the decades, telling his story to the first person who had ever come to listen. The entries began with professional observations, notes about rock formations and soil samples, and the logistics of surveying in difficult terrain. But even in these early pages, Ethan could sense the man behind the words, intelligent, dedicated, with a deep love for the mountains and a pride in his work. He wrote about the beauty of the wilderness, about the satisfaction of solving geological puzzles, about missing his wife and looking forward to returning home. He seemed like a good man, an honest man, and Ethan felt a fierce determination rising in his chest. He would read this journal to the end. He would learn what had happened to Samuel Whitmore, and then he would make sure the world knew too. Ethan sat on the cold stone floor of the cave, his back against the wall, the journal open in his lap and his flashlight propped beside him to illuminate the pages. He read slowly, carefully, letting Samuel Whitmore's words transport him back more than 60 years to a time when this man had been alive and full of purpose, walking these same mountains with his surveying equipment and his leather satchel and his dreams of discovery. The early entries were technical, filled with terminology Ethan did not fully understand. Strike and dip measurements, soil compositions, geological formations. But threaded through the professional observations was a genuine love for the work and for the wilderness in which it was conducted. Samuel wrote about waking before dawn to watch the mist rise from the valleys, about the satisfaction of solving a difficult surveying problem, about the way the light fell through the forest canopy in the late afternoon. He wrote about missing his wife Eleanor, but feeling that she would understand, that she knew this work was part of who he was. He seemed happy in those early pages, a man doing what he was born to do in a place that filled him with wonder. Then came the discovery. Ethan felt his pulse quicken as he read the entry dated the 15th of June, 1962. Samuel's handwriting was more hurried than usual, the letters slanting forward as if they could not wait to reach the page. He had found something extraordinary, something that exceeded his wildest expectations. Running through the heart of Black Rock Mountain was a vein of rare earth minerals of exceptional purity and concentration. His tests had confirmed it multiple times, and he had traced the deposit through several formations. The vein was massive, extending for what appeared to be miles through the mountain's core. Samuel's calculations suggested it was worth hundreds of millions of dollars, perhaps more, enough to make Consolidated Mining Corporation one of the wealthiest companies in the country. His excitement was palpable in the words on the page. He wrote about the magnitude of the find, about what it would mean for his career and his reputation, about how he could not wait to file his report and share the news with his superiors. He wrote about buying Eleanor the house she had always wanted, about finally having the financial security they had worked so hard to achieve. For several entries, Samuel was consumed by the thrill of his discovery, mapping the extent of the vein with meticulous care, collecting samples, documenting everything with the precision of a man who knew he was holding history in his hands. But then, gradually, the tone of the journal began to shift. The excitement faded, replaced by something darker and more troubled. As Samuel traced the mineral vein through the mountain, he began to understand the full implications of extracting it. The deposit did not exist in isolation. It was threaded through the aquifers that fed Cedar Hollow's wells and streams, through the watershed that supplied water to hundreds of families in the valley below. To mine the vein would require strip mining the entire mountain, blasting away millions of tons of rock, using chemicals and processes that would inevitably contaminate the water supply. Samuel wrote about the families he had seen in town, about the children playing in the creek, about the old-timers who had lived on this land for generations. He wrote about the calculations he had run, the models he had built, and the inescapable conclusion they had led him to. Extracting the minerals would destroy Cedar Hollow. The water would be poisoned for decades. The people would have to leave their homes, their farms, their lives. The corporation would become unimaginably wealthy, and an entire community would pay the price. His neat handwriting grew more agitated as the weight of this knowledge pressed down upon him. He had found a fortune, and it was a curse. The journal entries that followed were painful to read, the words of a man being torn apart by his own conscience. Ethan could feel Samuel's anguish rising from the pages like heat from a fire, could sense the sleepless nights and the tormented days that had produced these cramped, hurried paragraphs. In late July of 1962, executives from Consolidated Mining Corporation had visited the site to review Samuel's preliminary findings. He described them in terms that dripped with contempt. Men in expensive suits who had never dirtied their hands with honest work, who looked at the mountain and saw only dollar signs, who spoke of tonnage and profit margins while remaining utterly blind to the human cost of their ambitions. Their eyes gleamed with greed, Samuel wrote, and their plans were monstrous. They intended to strip mine the entire mountain, to blast away the peaks and ridges that had stood for millennia, to extract every ounce of precious mineral regardless of the consequences. They spoke casually of the process as if it were merely a technical challenge to be overcome. The dynamite and the heavy machinery, the chemical leaching pools, the mountains of toxic tailings that would have to be stored somewhere. When Samuel raised concerns about the watershed, about the streams and aquifers that would inevitably be contaminated, they had waved him off with talk of mitigation measures and acceptable losses. Acceptable losses. The phrase haunted Samuel, appearing again and again in his journal like a wound that would not heal. He could not stop thinking about what those words really meant. He thought about the families in Cedar Hollow, people he had come to know during his months on the mountain, people who had welcomed him into their homes and their lives with simple mountain hospitality. He thought about the old farmer who had shared his lunch with Samuel one afternoon and told him stories about growing up in the hollow, about 5 generations of his family who had drunk from the same spring and fished the same creek. He thought about the children he saw playing in that creek every time he drove through town, splashing in the clear, cold water without any idea that powerful men in distant boardrooms were planning to turn it into a toxic sludge pit. He thought about what would happen to these people when the mining began, how they would be forced from their land, their wells poisoned, their way of life destroyed, and all so that a corporation could add zeros to its balance sheet. The sleepless nights piled up, and Samuel's entries became more fragmented, more desperate. He wrote about lying awake in his tent, staring at the canvas above him, feeling the weight of an impossible choice pressing down on his chest. If he filed his report, he would be responsible for the destruction of an entire community. If he refused, he would be throwing away his career, his reputation, everything he had worked for. For weeks he wrestled with the decision, and Ethan could see the toll it took on him in the increasingly ragged handwriting, the sentences that trailed off unfinished, the pages that were wrinkled as if they had been wet with something that might have been rain or might have been tears. Finally, in an entry dated the 3rd of September 1962, Samuel made his choice. He would not file his report. He would not give the corporation the information it needed to destroy Cedar Hollow. Instead, he would hide the evidence, all of it, the surveys, the samples, the maps, everything that proved the deposit existed. And then he would take it to the federal authorities, to people who had the power to protect both the minerals and the town, to ensure that if the deposit was ever mined, it would be done responsibly, and the people of the valley would be protected. It was a dangerous plan, he knew, but it was the only way he could live with himself. The final pages of the journal told a story of mounting terror, and Ethan felt his own fear rising as he read the words of a man who knew he was being hunted. In the days after Samuel made his decision, everything changed. He began to notice things that had escaped his attention before, small details that now seemed laden with menace. A black sedan parked on the main street of Cedar Hollow with 2 men inside who never got out, just sat there watching the townspeople pass by. Strangers in dark suits appearing at the general store, asking the owner questions about the surveyor who had been working on the mountain, where he stayed, where he ate, who he talked to. Samuel recognized the tactics immediately. He had served in the army during the war and had seen how organizations dealt with people who became inconvenient. He was being watched, and he knew that the watching was only the first step. The corporation had realized that he was not going to file his report, and they were trying to determine how much of a threat he posed and how best to neutralize it. His handwriting changed in these entries, becoming hurried and erratic, the letters slanting wildly as if his hand could barely keep up with his racing thoughts. He wrote about varying his routines, about taking different routes to and from the mountain, about watching his rearview mirror for cars that stayed behind him too long. He wrote about the cave he had discovered during his surveys, a hidden chamber that did not appear on any map, that he had told no one about because some instinct had warned him to keep it secret. Now he understood why. The cave would be his vault, the place where he would hide the evidence until he could get it to safety. He made multiple trips, carrying the documents and samples in his satchel, concealing them in the chamber where no one would ever think to look. He wrote about his plan to wait until the heat died down, to let the corporation think he had been frightened into silence, and then to slip away to Washington where he had a contact in the Department of the Interior, a man he had served with who could be trusted. He would hand over the evidence and let the federal government decide how to proceed. The mountain would be protected, the town would be saved, and Samuel could finally go home to Eleanor and try to forget the nightmare of the past months. but the final entry told Ethan that the plan had failed. It was dated the 15th of October, 1962, just 8 days before the newspaper article reported Samuel missing. The handwriting was almost illegible, scrawled in obvious haste, the pen pressing so hard it had torn the paper in places. "They have found me." The words hit Ethan like a punch to the chest. "I do not know how, but they know about the cave. I saw them on the trail below, 3 men moving fast, and I know they are coming for me. There is no time to escape. I will hide here and pray they pass by. But if they find this place, if I do not return, let this record stand. The evidence is in the satchel. It proves everything. The deposit, the plans, the threat to the town. Someone must take it to Washington. Someone must protect the mountain. The people of Cedar Hollow have done nothing wrong. They do not deserve to lose their homes, their water, their lives. God forgive me for what I could not stop." That was all. No signature, no farewell to Eleanor, no final words of hope. Just the desperate plea of a man who knew he was about to die and wanted his death to mean something. Ethan closed the journal, his hands shaking, his eyes burning with tears he did not try to stop. Ethan sat motionless on the cold stone floor, the journal resting closed in his lap, his eyes fixed on the skeleton of Samuel Whitmore across the chamber. The beam of his flashlight had grown weaker, the batteries draining, but he barely noticed. His mind was filled with the weight of what he had read, the story of a man who had faced an impossible choice and made the right decision even though it had cost him everything. Samuel had been a professional doing his job when he stumbled upon something that would have made him wealthy and respected, and he had thrown it all away to protect people he barely knew. He had died alone in this dark place, his body never recovered, his sacrifice never recognized, his wife left to wonder for the rest of her life what had happened to him. The injustice of it burned in Ethan's chest like a coal, and he felt something he had never experienced before, a sense of responsibility that extended beyond himself and his own troubles, a connection to this dead man that transcended the 60 years between them. He understood now why he had been drawn to this place, why the mountain had called him here on this particular day when he had been searching for escape from his own pain. He had been meant to find Samuel Whitmore. He had been meant to finish what Samuel had started. With renewed purpose, Ethan turned his attention to the other documents in the satchel. He spread them out on the cave floor, examining each one in the dimming light of his flashlight. There were geological surveys covered in technical notations he could not fully decipher, but he understood enough to recognize their significance. There were assay reports from a laboratory showing the composition and purity of the mineral samples, the numbers circled and underlined with obvious excitement. There was the hand-drawn map he had noticed earlier, and now he studied it more carefully. It showed Black Rock Mountain in detail, with the mineral vein marked in red ink, snaking through the rock formations like a river of treasure. Samuel had noted depths and thicknesses, had calculated tonnages and values, had documented everything with the precision of a man who knew his evidence would need to withstand scrutiny. At the bottom of the satchel, Ethan found something that made his throat tighten with emotion, a bundle of letters, tied together with a piece of string, addressed to Eleanor Whitmore at the house in Ridgemont. They had never been sent. Ethan untied the string and unfolded the first letter, feeling as if he were intruding on something private but unable to stop himself. The words were tender and full of love, full of longing for home and promises to return soon. Samuel wrote about missing his wife's cooking and her laugh, and the way she hummed while she worked in the garden. He wrote about the life they would build together when this job was finished, the children they would have, the places they would travel. But as Ethan read through the letters, he saw the tone change just as it had in the journal. The later letters were full of apology and regret, full of cryptic references to a difficult decision and a burden he had to carry. The last letter was unfinished, breaking off mid-sentence, as if Samuel had been interrupted and never returned. Ethan carefully folded the letters and placed them back in the satchel with the other documents. He knew what he had to do. He could not leave this evidence here to molder in the darkness for another 60 years. Samuel Whitmore had died trying to get it to people who could act on it, and Ethan would honor that sacrifice by completing the mission. But even as he made this resolution, doubt crept into his mind. He was 13 years old, a boy from a poor family in a small town. Who would believe his story about a hidden cave and a skeleton and a mineral deposit worth millions? Who would listen to him when powerful corporations had already proven they would kill to keep this secret buried? He needed help, but he did not know where to find it. The late afternoon sun struck Ethan's eyes like a blow when he emerged from the cave, and he stood blinking at the entrance, his vision swimming with spots of color after so long in the darkness. The world outside seemed impossibly bright and alive after the cold stillness of the chamber, the wind rustling through the ancient trees, birds calling in the canopy above, the smell of pine and earth and growing things filling his nostrils. But everything looked different now, as if he were seeing it through new eyes, eyes that carried the knowledge of what lay hidden beneath the surface. The mountain was no longer just a wilderness to explore or a refuge from his troubles. It was a vault containing secrets that powerful men had killed to protect, and Ethan was now the only living person who knew where those secrets were buried. The weight of that knowledge pressed down on him as he stood at the cave entrance, and for a moment he felt paralyzed by the enormity of what he had stumbled into. Then his training took over, the lessons his father had drilled into him since he was old enough to walk. He could not leave the cave entrance exposed. If anyone else found this place, the evidence would disappear and Samuel Whitmore's death would remain meaningless forever. Working quickly, Ethan pulled the moss and vines back over the opening, arranging them to look as natural as possible, covering any signs of his disturbance. When he was satisfied, he stepped back and studied the rock face. It looked exactly as it had when he first discovered it, a section of stone that was perhaps a little too regular but that would escape notice from anyone who was not specifically searching for it. Then he turned in a slow circle, memorizing the landmarks around him. The lightning-scarred pine 30 yards to the north, the distinctive boulder shaped like a crouching bear to the east, the way the ridgeline above formed a notch against the sky. He fixed these details in his mind using the techniques his father had taught him for navigating in the wilderness, creating a mental map that would lead him back to this exact spot. He would not write it down, would not risk anyone else finding directions to the cave. The map would exist only in his memory, as safe as anything could be. The hike home was a blur of racing thoughts and churning emotions. The satchel in his pack felt like it weighed 100 pounds, the documents inside seeming to pulse with significance against his back. He moved quickly, retracing his route through the old-growth forest, past the strange rock formations, down through the familiar territory of his childhood. But his mind was not on the trail. He thought about his family's troubles, about the foreclosure notices piling up on the kitchen table, about his father lying broken in his bed, about his mother working herself to exhaustion trying to hold everything together. He thought about the mineral deposit hidden in the mountain, worth hundreds of millions of dollars, enough to solve every problem his family had ever faced 1,000 times over. For a wild moment he imagined what that money could do: pay off the medical bills, save the house, restore his father's pride, give his mother the rest she so desperately needed. But then he thought about Samuel Whitmore, about the choice the surveyor had made, about the people of Cedar Hollow who would lose everything if the deposit were mined. He thought about the children playing in the creek that would become a toxic waste pit, and he knew he could never trade their futures for his family's comfort. The money was a curse, just as Samuel had written. It arrived back at the cabin well after dark, the windows glowing with lamplight, and before he even reached the porch, the door flew open and his mother rushed out. Her face was pale with worry, her eyes red-rimmed, and she grabbed him by the shoulders with a grip that was almost painful. She had been frantic, she told him, had been about to call the sheriff to organize a search party. He apologized, his voice hollow with exhaustion, and told her he had lost track of time in the woods. She held him tightly, her body trembling with relief, and he felt a stab of guilt for the fear he had caused her. He said nothing about the cave or the skeleton or the satchel hidden in his pack. Not yet. He needed time to think, to decide what to do with the terrible and wonderful secret he now carried. The house was quiet, his mother finally asleep after checking on him 3 times to make sure he was really home and safe, his father lost in his medication-induced fog in the back bedroom. Ethan lay in his narrow bed beneath the slanted ceiling of his small room, the satchel tucked beneath his mattress where no one would think to look, and he stared at the darkness above him with eyes that would not close. His body ached with exhaustion from the long hike, his muscles sore and his feet blistered, but his mind was electric, crackling with thoughts that would not let him rest. After an hour of lying there in the dark, he could stand it no longer. He reached under his bed and retrieved the satchel, then pulled his flashlight from his pack and clicked it on, shielding the beam with his blanket to keep the light from showing under his door. He opened Samuel Whitmore's journal and began to read it again from the beginning, slowly this time, absorbing every detail he had rushed past in the cave. He read about Samuel's early career as a surveyor, his marriage to Eleanor, his pride in his work and his reputation for honesty and thoroughness. He read about the man's love for the mountains and his respect for the land, his belief that natural resources should be developed responsibly and that the people who lived on the land should be protected. He read about the discovery of the mineral deposit and the terrible knowledge that had come with it. The understanding that the corporation he worked for would destroy an entire community to extract the treasure hidden in the rock. He read about the decision Samuel had made, the plan to hide the evidence and take it to federal authorities, and the fear that had consumed his final days as he realized he was being hunted. This time, knowing how the story ended, knowing that the man who wrote these words had died alone in the darkness just a few hundred yards from where Ethan now lay, the journal hit him with even greater force. He felt as if he knew Samuel Whitmore, as if the surveyor had become a friend across the decades, and the injustice of his death was almost unbearable. When he finished the journal, Ethan turned to the other documents. He unfolded the geological surveys and spread them on his bed, trying to make sense of the technical notations. He was not a geologist, but he understood enough to grasp the basic picture. The mineral vein was enormous, running for miles through the heart of the mountain, and it was still there, untouched, waiting in the darkness just as Samuel had left it 60 years ago. The assay reports confirmed that the minerals were rare and valuable, worth even more today than they had been in 1962. He studied the hand-drawn map tracing the red line of the vein with his finger, and he felt a strange mixture of awe and dread. He was holding information worth hundreds of millions of dollars, perhaps billions in today's market. The implications made his head spin. His family was about to lose their home. His father was broken, his mother exhausted, and they were drowning in debt they had no way to pay. This discovery could save them. If Ethan came forward with the evidence, if the mineral deposit was developed, his family might receive some compensation, some share of the wealth that would transform their lives. But then he thought about Samuel's warnings, about the streams that would be poisoned and the families that would be displaced. He thought about the children playing in the creek and the old farmers who had lived on this land for generations. Would revealing the deposit bring the same destruction Samuel had died to prevent? Or was there another way, some path that could save his family and protect the town at the same time? The questions chased each other through his mind like animals caught in a trap, and he found no answers. Finally, in the small hours of the morning, exhaustion overcame him, and he fell into a fitful sleep. He dreamed of dark tunnels and cold stone, of skeletal hands reaching out to him from the shadows, of a voice that might have been Samuel Whitmore's whispering that the truth must come out, that the mountain must be protected, that some secrets are too important to stay buried forever. Ethan woke late the next morning, his body heavy with fatigue, his mind foggy from the restless night. His mother had already left for her shift at the diner, and his father was silent in the back bedroom, lost in his own world of pain and regret. Ethan forced himself to eat some cold cereal, though it tasted like cardboard in his mouth, and then he sat at the kitchen table and stared at the pile of bills and notices that seemed to grow larger every day. He thought about the satchel hidden under his bed, about the fortune buried in the mountain, about the decision that lay before him like a fork in a dark road. He needed help. He needed someone who could tell him more about the history of this place, someone who might understand the implications of what he had found without immediately dismissing him as a foolish child with an overactive imagination. And he knew exactly who that person was. Harold Benson had owned the general store on Main Street for as long as anyone could remember. He was in his 80s now, a thin man with a shock of white hair and keen blue eyes that missed nothing, and he was known throughout Cedar Hollow as the unofficial historian of the town. If you wanted to know about the old families, or the abandoned mines, or the way things used to be before the timber industry declined, Harold was the one you asked. He had a reputation for honesty and plain speaking, and Ethan had always liked him, had always felt that Harold looked at him and saw a person rather than just a kid to be patronized. The bell above the door chimed as Ethan entered the store, and the familiar smell of the place wrapped around him, sawdust and leather and coffee and the faint mustiness of old wood. Harold was behind the counter as always, reading a newspaper through wire-rimmed glasses, and he looked up as Ethan approached, his weathered face creased into a smile of genuine warmth. He asked about Ethan's father, his voice gentle with concern, and Ethan gave the expected answer. He was doing as well as could be expected. Then there was a pause, and Harold's sharp eyes studied the boy's face, clearly sensing that this was not just a social visit. Ethan had rehearsed what he would say on the walk into town, but now that he was here, the words felt clumsy and transparent. He started with a question about the mountain, trying to keep his tone casual, asking if Harold knew anything about the history of Blackrock and whether there had ever been any mining up there. The old man's eyebrows rose slightly, and Ethan saw a flicker of interest in his gaze. Harold set down his newspaper and leaned forward on the counter, his expression thoughtful. He told Ethan that there had indeed been interest in Blackrock Mountain many years ago, back in the early 60s. A company called Consolidated Mining Corporation had come to Cedar Hollow and started buying up land and mineral rights all through the valley. They had brought in surveyors and geologists, had conducted tests and assessments, and there had been talk that they were going to open a major mining operation that would bring jobs and prosperity to the whole region. But then, suddenly, the company had abandoned the project. They had packed up and left almost overnight, and no one had ever explained why. The mineral rights they had purchased had eventually reverted to the original owners or been absorbed by the county, and Consolidated Mining had never returned. Ethan felt his heart beating faster as he listened, recognizing the outlines of the story he had read in Samuel's journal. He asked if Harold knew anything else about that time, if there was any explanation for why the company had left so abruptly. The old man was quiet for a moment, his eyes distant with memory, and then he mentioned the surveyor, a man named Whitmore who had been working for the company and had disappeared on the mountain. There had been search parties, Harold said, but they never found a trace of him. Some folks said the mountain had taken him, that he had fallen into a crevasse or been caught in a rock slide. But there were others, Harold continued, his voice dropping lower, who said it was something worse. He did not elaborate, but his meaning was clear. Ethan thanked him and left the store, his mind churning with everything he had heard and everything he had not said. Ethan spent the rest of the day wandering through town in a daze, his mind wrestling with the decision that loomed before him. He sat by the creek for an hour, watching the water flow over the smooth stones, thinking about Samuel Whitmore and the choice the surveyor had made all those years ago. He walked past the houses of families he had known his whole life, people who had no idea that their water supply and their way of life had once been threatened by forces they could not see. He thought about his father lying in that bed, his mother working herself to the bone, and the foreclosure notices that would soon take away the only home he had ever known. By the time the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, he had made his decision. He could not do this alone. He needed an ally, someone with knowledge and experience, someone who understood the history of this place and could help him navigate the dangerous waters ahead. Harold Benson was the only person who fit that description, the only adult in Cedar Hollow that Ethan trusted enough to share his secret. He waited until after the store's closing time, watching from across the street as the last customers left, and Harold began his nightly routine of sweeping the floor and tallying the register. When the lights in the main room dimmed and only the lamp in the back office remained lit, Ethan crossed the street and knocked on the door. Harold appeared a moment later, surprise evident on his weathered face, and Ethan asked if they could talk. Something in the boy's expression must have conveyed the seriousness of the request, because Harold stepped aside without a word and let him in. They sat in the back office, a small, cluttered room that smelled of old paper and pipe tobacco, and Ethan told him everything. He described finding the cave, discovering the skeleton, reading the journal. He pulled the leather satchel from his pack and placed it on the desk between them, then removed the journal and the newspaper clipping and handed them to Harold. The old man's hands were steady as he took the items, but his face went pale as he began to read. He recognized the name Samuel Whitmore immediately, remembered the search parties and the rumors that had swirled through town after the surveyor's disappearance. He read the journal entries in silence, his expression growing more troubled with each page, and when he finished, he sat back in his chair and let out a long, slow breath. He looked at Ethan with eyes that held a new respect, and perhaps a new fear. Harold confirmed what Ethan had suspected. Consolidated Mining Corporation had not simply vanished after abandoning the Cedar Hollow project. It had changed names several times over the decades, merging with other companies, restructuring, evolving with the times. It was now part of a massive conglomerate called Apex Resources, one of the most powerful mining companies in the country, with operations on every continent and political connections at the highest levels of government. If the mineral deposit in Blackrock Mountain was as valuable as Samuel's surveys indicated, Apex would want it badly enough to do almost anything. Harold leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, and warned Ethan that these were dangerous people with long memories and longer reach. They had killed Samuel Whitmore 60 years ago, or at least someone working for them had, and they would not hesitate to protect their interests again. He urged Ethan to be careful, to think very hard about what he did next, because once he started down this road there would be no turning back. Ethan listened, his stomach tight with fear. But he did not waver. He had already made his choice. The walk home from Harold's store felt longer than usual. Each step weighted with the gravity of what Ethan had set in motion. He could not take this back now. He had shared the secret with one person, and that meant the circle of knowledge had already begun to expand beyond his control. But Harold was right about one thing. Ethan could not navigate this alone. He was 13 years old, and he was dealing with forces that had already killed one man, and would not hesitate to kill again. He needed his family. He needed his father. The thought of telling Thomas filled him with a complicated mix of hope and dread. His father had been a ghost for 3 months, a man who existed in body but had retreated so far into himself that he seemed unreachable. But Ethan remembered the man his father had been before the accident, the sharp mind and the steady hands and the quiet authority that had made him one of the most respected men in Cedar Hollow. If anyone could help him figure out what to do with this discovery, it was Thomas Cole, and maybe, just maybe, giving his father a problem to solve would bring him back from wherever he had gone. Ethan found his mother in the kitchen preparing a simple dinner, her face drawn with exhaustion. He told her he needed to talk to his father about something important, and she looked at him with a strange expression, part curiosity and part desperate hope, before nodding and stepping aside. He walked down the short hallway to the back bedroom, his heart hammering against his ribs, the satchel clutched tightly in his hands. His father was lying in the bed as always, his shattered leg elevated on pillows, his eyes fixed on the ceiling as if searching for something in the patterns of the wood grain above him. He did not look at Ethan when the boy entered, did not acknowledge his presence at all. Ethan sat down in the chair beside the bed, the same chair where he had sat so many times over the past 3 months, trying to reach a man who did not want to be reached. But this time was different. This time he had something to say that could not be ignored. He took a deep breath and began to talk. He told his father about the hike into the mountains, about going farther than he had ever gone before, about finding the hidden cave behind the moss-covered rock face. He described the chamber with its strange carvings, the skeleton slumped against the wall, the satchel clutched in bony fingers. He told him about Samuel Whitmore, about the journal and the surveys and the mineral deposit worth hundreds of millions of dollars. He told him about Harold Benson and what the old man had said about Apex Resources and the danger they faced. As Ethan spoke, something extraordinary happened. His father's eyes moved from the ceiling to his son's face, and for the first time in months there was light in them, a spark of the old Thomas Cole returning from wherever he had been hiding. He struggled to sit up, wincing at the pain in his leg but pushing through it with a determination Ethan had not seen since the accident. He began asking questions, sharp and focused, his foreman's mind engaging with the problem like a machine coming back to life after a long dormancy. He asked about the location of the cave, about the condition of the documents, about exactly what Harold had said regarding the mining company. Ethan answered as best he could, and then he handed over the satchel. His father opened it with hands that trembled slightly, whether from weakness or emotion Ethan could not tell, and he began to read Samuel Whitmore's journal. The room was silent except for the turning of pages and the distant sound of Ethan's mother moving in the kitchen. When Thomas finally looked up, his face had changed. There was pride there, pride in his son for what he had found and how he had handled it. But there was also fear, a recognition of the danger that had just entered their lives. He reached out and gripped Ethan's shoulder with a strength that surprised them both. His voice was rough with disuse but steady with purpose. "You have found something important, son, and something dangerous. We need to think this through very carefully." Something shifted in the cabin that night, a change in the air itself that Ethan could feel but not quite name. His father did not retreat back into silence after reading the journal. Instead, he asked Ethan to help him sit up higher in the bed, to bring him a pad of paper and a pencil, to fetch the old maps of the county that were stored in a trunk in the attic. For the first time in 3 months, Thomas Cole had a purpose beyond enduring his pain, and the transformation was remarkable to witness. His eyes were clear and focused, his voice stronger than it had been since the accident, his mind working with the sharp efficiency that had once made him the best foreman Holloway Timber had ever employed. They worked together through the night, father and son side by side, poring over the documents from Samuel's satchel and cross-referencing them with the county maps. Thomas explained things Ethan had never understood about land rights and mineral claims, about the complex web of laws that governed what could be taken from the earth and who had the right to take it. He showed Ethan how to read the property boundaries on the old maps, how to identify which parcels were privately owned and which belonged to the county or the federal government. As they worked, a picture began to emerge. The mineral vein that Samuel had discovered ran through multiple properties, including a significant portion of public land that was part of the national forest. This was important, Thomas explained, because it meant that no single entity could simply buy up the rights and start mining. There were federal regulations to consider, environmental impact assessments, public comment periods. If they handled this correctly, there might be ways to benefit from the discovery while still protecting the mountain and the watershed that the people of Cedar Hollow depended on. But they needed expert help. Thomas was a timberman, not a lawyer, and the legal complexities of mineral rights and environmental protection were far beyond his expertise. He sat quietly for a long moment, his brow furrowed in thought, and then he made a decision that Ethan could see cost him something. He asked Ethan to bring him the old address book from the desk in the living room. He had not contacted anyone from his past life in months, had refused all visitors and ignored all calls, but now he flipped through the worn pages until he found what he was looking for: Frank Delgado. The name meant nothing to Ethan, but his father explained that Frank was an old army buddy from his service days, a man he had fought beside and trusted with his life. After the military, Frank had gone to law school and become an attorney specializing in environmental law, working to protect wilderness areas and hold corporations accountable for the damage they caused. He was exactly the kind of person they needed, if he was willing to help. Thomas made the call the next morning, and Ethan watched his father's face as he spoke to his old friend for the first time in years. There was shame there, shame at having cut himself off from everyone who cared about him, but also a tentative hope as the conversation continued. Frank listened to the story, asked a few pointed questions, and then said the words that made Ethan's heart leap in his chest. He would come to Cedar Hollow. He would review the documents and help them figure out what to do. He could be there in 3 days. When Thomas hung up the phone, he looked at Ethan with an expression the boy had not seen in months. It was not quite a smile, but it was close. For the first time since the accident, there was hope in the small cabin on the edge of town, a fragile flame that Ethan was determined to protect. The 3 days before Frank Delgado's arrival were the longest of Ethan's life, each hour stretching into an eternity of waiting and watching and growing unease. At first he told himself he was imagining things, that the stress and the sleepless nights were making him paranoid. But by the second day, he knew the truth. They were being watched. The first sign was the black SUV. It appeared on the morning after his father made the phone call, a large vehicle with tinted windows so dark you could not see who was inside. It drove slowly past their cabin, slowing even further as it passed their driveway, then continued down the road and disappeared around the bend. An hour later it came back, making the same slow pass, and then again in the afternoon. Ethan stood at the window and watched it, his stomach tight with dread, and he thought about Samuel Whitmore's journal entries describing the black sedan that had appeared in Cedar Hollow 60 years ago, the strangers in dark suits who asked questions about the surveyor who was causing problems. The parallels were too clear to ignore. Then came the man across the street. Ethan first noticed him when he walked into town to buy milk for his mother, a figure in a dark suit standing on the corner near the general store, seemingly looking at nothing in particular. But when Ethan glanced back, the man was watching him, and their eyes met for just a moment before the stranger looked away. The next day, Ethan saw him again, this time standing across the street from their cabin, making no effort to hide his presence. He was sending a message: "We know who you are, and we know where you live." The phone calls started that night. The phone would ring at odd hours, 2 in the morning, 4 in the morning, and when Ethan or his mother answered, there would be silence on the line, a presence that breathed but did not speak, and then a click as the connection was severed. The calls were meant to frighten, to remind them that they were not safe, even in their own home. And they worked. Ethan lay awake in his bed, staring at the ceiling, his heart jumping every time the phone shrilled in the darkness. He thought about Samuel Whitmore in his final days, the surveyor's growing terror as he realized he was being hunted, the desperation of his last journal entry scrawled in haste as the men closed in. The same forces that had killed Samuel were out there now, circling the cabin like wolves, and Ethan was only 13 years old. He could not hide his fear from his father. Thomas saw it in his son's eyes, in the way he flinched at sudden sounds and kept looking out the windows at the empty road. One evening, As they sat together in the back bedroom reviewing the documents for the 100th time, Thomas reached out and took Ethan by the shoulder, his grip firm and steady despite his weakened condition. He looked his son in the eyes and spoke with a quiet intensity that Ethan had not heard since before the accident. He acknowledged the danger they faced, acknowledged that the people who wanted this secret buried would not hesitate to use violence to achieve their aims. But he also made a promise, his voice rough with emotion and determination. They would see this through together. They had the truth on their side, and they had each other, and no one was going to hurt this family. He would protect Ethan with his last breath if it came to that. Ethan looked at his father, at the man who had been broken and silent for so long, and he saw that Thomas Cole had returned from wherever he had been. The promise was not empty words. It was a vow, and Ethan believed it. Frank Delgado arrived on a gray Thursday morning, driving a dusty sedan that had seen better days but moved with the reliability of a vehicle that was maintained by someone who valued function over form. He was a compact man in his 50s, with close-cropped gray hair and sharp dark eyes that seemed to take in everything at once, missing nothing and revealing little. His handshake was firm when he greeted Ethan, and there was no condescension in the way he looked at the boy, only a careful assessment that made Ethan feel he was being taken seriously. Frank embraced Thomas like the old friend he was, and Ethan saw something pass between them, an acknowledgement of the years that had separated them and the circumstances that had brought them back together. There was no small talk, no wasted time on pleasantries. Frank was a man who understood urgency, and he had driven through the night to get here because the situation Thomas had described on the phone could not wait. They gathered in the back bedroom, where Thomas was still confined to his bed, and Ethan spread the contents of Samuel's satchel on the blanket for Frank to examine. The attorney put on a pair of reading glasses and began to go through the documents one by one, his expression growing more intense with each page he turned. He read the journal entries in their entirety, pausing occasionally to ask Ethan questions about the cave and the skeleton and the exact location of the find. He studied the geological surveys and the assay reports with the eye of someone who understood their significance, letting out a low whistle when he saw the estimated value of the mineral deposit. When he finished, he removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes, and for a long moment he said nothing at all. Then he looked at Thomas and Ethan with an expression that mixed amazement with grave concern. He confirmed what they had suspected. The mineral deposit was extraordinarily valuable, worth far more today than it had been in 1962 due to the increased demand for rare earth elements in modern technology. But he also confirmed something that offered a glimmer of hope. Based on Samuel's surveys and the county maps Thomas had gathered, the majority of the mineral vein lay beneath federal land that was part of the national forest. Only a small portion extended onto private property, including a sliver that crossed into the land owned by the Cole family. This was good news, Frank explained, because it meant that Apex Resources could not simply buy the mineral rights and begin extraction. Federal land came with federal protections, environmental regulations, required impact assessments, and public oversight. There were legal barriers that even a company as powerful as Apex could not easily overcome, but it also meant the path forward was complicated. They could not simply announce the discovery and expect justice to prevail. Apex had resources and connections that could bury the story, discredit the evidence, and make problems disappear. Frank had seen it happen before with other corporations. They needed a strategy that would protect both the evidence and the family. He proposed a bold plan. They would take the documents to the state attorney general, who had a reputation for independence and a history of standing up to corporate interests. Simultaneously, they would leak the story to a journalist Frank knew and trusted, someone who had broken major environmental stories before and could not be bought or intimidated. The goal was to create so much public attention, so much sunlight on the situation, that Apex could not make the evidence or the family disappear without the whole world watching. It was risky, Frank admitted, but it was their best chance. Frank left that evening to begin making the necessary contacts, promising to return the next day with a concrete timeline for their plan. He warned them to be vigilant, to keep the documents hidden, and to call him immediately if anything seemed wrong. Ethan watched the attorney's sedan disappear down the road and felt a cold knot of anxiety tighten in his stomach. The wheels were in motion now, and there was no turning back. His mother came home from her shift at the diner looking more exhausted than usual, and Ethan helped her prepare a simple dinner while his father rested in the back bedroom. They ate in near silence, each lost in their own thoughts. and then his mother kissed him goodnight and retreated to her room to collapse into the sleep of the utterly depleted. Ethan checked on his father one last time, found him dozing with the lamp still on, and then went to his own small room at the front of the cabin. He placed the satchel under his bed as he had every night since finding it, but this time he pulled it out again and held it in his lap, unwilling to let it out of his sight. He must have fallen asleep sitting up, because the next thing he knew he was jerking awake to a sound that did not belong. It was the creak of the back door, the one that led into the kitchen, a sound he knew as well as his own heartbeat because that door had been creaking the same way his entire life. But no one in the family used that door at night. His blood turned to ice in his veins. He heard footsteps, heavy and deliberate, moving through the kitchen into the living room. Then voices, low and muffled, two men speaking to each other in tones that were not meant to be overheard. Ethan's body moved before his mind could catch up, instinct and terror propelling him off his bed and into the small closet in the corner of his room. He pulled the satchel tight against his chest and pressed himself into the darkest corner behind his hanging clothes, his heart pounding so loud he was sure they would hear it. Through the thin walls, he could hear them ransacking the house, opening drawers and cabinets, throwing things onto the floor. One of them called out in a voice that was cold and flat, demanding to know where the documents were, saying they knew the boy had found something in the mountain and they wanted it back. Then he heard his father's voice, rough with sleep and pain but steady with defiance, telling them to get out of his house. There was a scuffle, the sound of something heavy falling, and then a sickening thud that could only be a fist striking flesh. Ethan bit down on his own hand to keep from crying out. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to run out there, to help his father, to do something. But his father's words echoed in his mind, protect the evidence. Samuel Whitmore had died for these documents. If Ethan gave them up now, that death would mean nothing, and these men would have won. So he stayed in the closet, tears streaming down his face, clutching the satchel like a lifeline while he listened to his father being beaten. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the men gave up. He heard them cursing, heard one of them say the documents were not here, heard them leave through the same back door they had entered. Only when the sound of their vehicle faded into the distance did Ethan emerge from his hiding place. He found his father on the floor of the hallway, his face bloodied, his broken leg twisted at an angle that made Ethan's stomach lurch. But Thomas was conscious, and when he saw his son standing there with the satchel still clutched to his chest, he managed a pained smile that broke Ethan's heart. "Did they get it?" he asked. Ethan shook his head. His father reached up and gripped his hand with surprising strength. "That is my boy." The break-in changed everything. Frank Delgado arrived at the cabin within an hour of Ethan's frantic phone call, and when he saw Thomas on the floor with blood on his face and his leg twisted beneath him, the attorney's expression hardened into something cold and dangerous. He helped Ethan get his father back into bed and called for an ambulance. Then he made another call, this one to a number he said he had hoped he would never need to use, the FBI field office in Charleston. By morning, the situation had transformed from a local secret into a federal investigation. Agents arrived at the cabin before dawn, taking photographs of the damage and collecting evidence of the break-in. They interviewed Ethan for hours, their questions probing but not unkind, and he told them everything from the beginning: the hike into the mountains, the hidden cave, the skeleton, the journal, all of it. He showed them the satchel and its contents, watched their eyes widen as they realized what they were looking at, and felt a weight begin to lift from his shoulders. He was no longer carrying this burden alone. The story broke 2 days later, and when it did, it broke like a dam. Frank's journalist contact published a devastating exposé detailing the 60-year cover-up, the murder of Samuel Whitmore, the mineral deposit worth billions, and the systematic efforts by Apex Resources to keep it all buried. The article named names and cited documents, connecting the modern corporation to the crimes of its predecessor with a trail of evidence that could not be denied. Within hours, the story had been picked up by every major news outlet in the country. Cedar Hollow, the forgotten little town in the Appalachian Mountains, was suddenly the center of national attention. The state attorney general announced a formal investigation before noon, holding a press conference in which she promised to pursue justice for Samuel Whitmore and hold accountable anyone involved in the cover-up. Reporters descended on the town like a swarm, their satellite trucks lining Main Street, their cameras pointed at every resident who stepped outside. The black SUVs that had circled the coal cabin disappeared overnight, and the men in suits who had watched Ethan from across the street were nowhere to be seen. Apex Resources issued a statement denying any involvement in criminal activity, but their words rang hollow against the weight of the evidence, and their stock price plummeted as investors fled. Ethan found himself at the center of the storm, the 13-year-old boy who had stumbled upon a secret that powerful men had killed to protect. Reporters wanted to interview him, cameras wanted to capture his face, and everyone wanted to hear the story of how he had found the cave and what it had felt like to discover the skeleton. His mother tried to shield him from the worst of it, but there was no escaping the reality that his life had changed forever. He gave a few carefully managed interviews with Frank by his side, answering questions as honestly as he could while trying to convey the gravity of what Samuel Whitmore had sacrificed. Through it all, even as the attention swirled around him and the investigation expanded and the world seemed to tilt on its axis, Ethan's thoughts kept returning to the man in the cave. Samuel Whitmore had started this journey 60 years ago, had given his life trying to protect this town and these people, and had died alone in the darkness without ever knowing if his sacrifice would mean anything. Now, finally, his story was being told. His name was being spoken. The truth he had died for was coming into the light. Ethan hoped that wherever Samuel was, he knew that someone had finally come to listen. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity that transformed Cedar Hollow from a forgotten backwater into a symbol of something larger than itself. The FBI investigation expanded rapidly, uncovering a trail of corruption and cover-up that stretched back 6 decades and implicated not only Apex Resources, but several smaller companies and a handful of local officials who had been paid to look the other way. Search warrants were executed, documents were seized, and one by one the pieces of the puzzle fell into place. But for Ethan, the most important moment came on a cold November morning when a team of forensic specialists entered the cave on Black Rock Mountain and carefully recovered the remains of Samuel Whitmore. They brought him down from the mountain in a flag-draped coffin, treating him with the dignity and respect that had been denied him for 60 years. And Ethan stood at the trailhead with his parents and watched the procession pass with tears streaming down his face. Samuel was finally coming home. The funeral was held in Ridgemont, the town where Samuel and Eleanor had lived as newlyweds before his final assignment took him to Cedar Hollow. Ethan and his parents made the 3-hour drive in their old truck, his father sitting upright in the passenger seat for the first time since the accident, his leg still in its brace, but his spirit stronger than it had been in months. The church was small and white, perched on a hillside overlooking a valley that reminded Ethan of home, and it was filled with people who had come to pay their respects to a man most of them had never known but whose story had touched them deeply. At the front of the church, in a wheelchair draped with a blanket, sat Eleanor Whitmore. She was 93 years old, her hair white as snow, her face a map of the decades she had spent not knowing what had happened to her husband. When Ethan approached her after the service, not knowing what to say, she reached out and took his hands in hers. Her grip was surprisingly strong, and her eyes, though wet with tears, were clear and bright. She thanked him for bringing Samuel home, thanked him for giving her an answer after a lifetime of questions, thanked him for being brave enough to do what was right, even when it was dangerous. Ethan tried to speak, tried to say that he had only done what anyone would have done, but the words caught in his throat. Eleanor smiled at him, a smile that held 60 years of grief and loss, but also something that looked like peace, and she told him that Samuel would have been proud. In the weeks that followed, the federal government took action to ensure that the tragedy would never be repeated. Black Rock Mountain was designated as a protected wilderness area, placed under the stewardship of the National Forest Service with strict prohibitions against mining or development of any kind. The rare earth minerals that Samuel had discovered would remain in the ground, a treasure preserved for future generations rather than extracted for the profit of a few. Environmental groups hailed the decision as a landmark victory, and Cedar Hollow became a symbol of what could be achieved when ordinary people stood up against powerful interests. Apex Resources faced the consequences of its crimes. Federal prosecutors brought charges against several current and former executives, accusing them of conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and accessory to murder. The company's stock continued to plummet, and there was talk of bankruptcy, of dissolution, of a corporate empire crumbling under the weight of its own sins. Justice, so long delayed, was finally being served. The letter arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, a thick envelope bearing the seal of the Department of the Interior that Ethan's mother held in trembling hands as she stood at the mailbox. She carried it inside without opening it, waiting until they were all together in the back bedroom where Thomas was sitting up in bed, his leg finally free of the metal brace, though still weak and stiff from months of disuse. Frank Delgado had warned them this was coming, had explained the legal process in his careful way, but nothing had prepared them for the reality of seeing it in writing. Because a portion of the mineral deposit extended onto the Cole family's property, the federal government was required to compensate them for the conservation easement that would prevent the minerals from ever being extracted. The amount was not a fortune, not the hundreds of millions that Apex Resources had hoped to reap from the mountain, but it was more money than the Cole family had ever seen in their lives. It was enough. Mary read the letter aloud, her voice breaking on certain words, and when she finished there was a long silence in the small bedroom. Then Thomas reached out and took his wife's hand, and he took Ethan's hand with his other, and he held them both as tears rolled down his weathered cheeks. It was enough to pay off the medical bills that had been crushing them, the statements from the hospital, and the surgeons and the rehabilitation specialists that had piled up like stones on a grave. It was enough to stop the foreclosure, to pay the back taxes on the house, to ensure that the cabin where Thomas had been born and where Ethan had grown up would remain in the family for another generation. It was enough to give Thomas time to heal properly, to work with the physical therapist who came twice a week, to slowly rebuild the strength in his shattered leg without the pressure of needing to return to work before his body was ready. And it was enough, perhaps, to imagine a different future, one where Ethan could go to college, and Mary could cut back her shifts, and Thomas could find work that did not require him to risk his life on a daily basis. The money mattered. Ethan would never pretend otherwise, but it was not the most important thing that had been restored. What mattered more was the change he saw in his father. The light had come back into Thomas Cole's eyes, the spark that had been extinguished by the accident and the shame and the helplessness of lying in that bed while his family struggled around him. He was engaged with the world again, reading the newspaper and following the investigation, and talking to Frank Delgado about the legal proceedings. He was doing his physical therapy exercises with determination rather than going through the motions. He was making plans for the future, talking about maybe starting a small business, teaching wilderness skills and guiding hunting trips, using the knowledge he had accumulated over a lifetime in these mountains. Most of all, he was present again, truly present, when he looked at his son. Ethan saw the pride in his father's eyes, pride not in the money or the attention, but in the choices Ethan had made when confronted with a difficult and dangerous situation. Thomas told him one evening, his voice rough with emotion, that Ethan had shown more courage and integrity at 13 than most men showed in a lifetime. He said that Samuel Whitmore would have been proud to know that his sacrifice had been honored by someone like Ethan. He said that he, Thomas Cole, was proud to be his father. Those words meant more to Ethan than all the money in the world. His father was no longer a broken man staring at the ceiling, lost in pain and despair. He was a father again, fully and completely, and their family had been made whole. Spring arrived in Cedar Hollow the way it always did, slowly at first and then all at once, the snow retreating up the mountainsides and the streams swelling with meltwater and the first green shoots pushing through the brown carpet of last year's leaves. The air softened and warmed, carrying the scent of wet earth and new growth, and the birds returned to fill the forest with songs that had been absent through the long, cold months. Ethan felt the change in his bones, a stirring of something that matched the awakening of the land around him. He had been through his own winter, a season of fear and struggle and transformation, and now he too was ready to emerge into the light. On a clear morning in late April, he set out for the mountain one last time. He had made arrangements through Frank Delgado and the National Forest Service, had obtained the necessary permissions, and in his pack he carried a small bronze plaque that had been cast according to his specifications. He hiked the familiar trail past the landmarks of his childhood, the stone bridge and the creek and the lightning-split oak, and then he continued upward into the old-growth forest, where the ancient trees stood like silent witnesses to the passing of ages. The cave entrance looked different now. The FBI forensic team had cleared away the vegetation during their recovery of Samuel's remains, and the Forest Service had installed a small gate to protect the site from vandals and curiosity seekers. But Ethan had a key, and he unlocked the gate and stepped inside, clicking on his flashlight as the darkness enveloped him. The passage felt less frightening than it had the first time, perhaps because he knew what lay ahead, or perhaps because he was no longer the same boy who had stumbled upon this place in search of escape from his troubles. The chamber was empty now, clean and bare, the skeleton and the satchel, and all the secrets they contained removed to other places where they would be preserved and studied and remembered. But the carvings on the walls remained, the ancient symbols and drawings that spoke of knowledge predating memory, and Ethan stood in the center of the space and let the silence settle around him like a blanket. He thought about Samuel Whitmore, about the man who had walked into this cave 60 years ago carrying a burden of knowledge that would cost him his life. He thought about the choice Samuel had made, the decision to protect strangers he would never meet rather than profit from their destruction. He thought about courage, and he realized that it was not what he had always imagined it to be. Courage was not the absence of fear. Courage was being afraid and deciding that something else was more important than the fear. Samuel had been afraid in his final days. His journal made that clear. But he had decided that the people of Cedar Hollow and the future of the mountain mattered more than his own safety. And in his own small way, Ethan had made the same decision. He had been terrified when those men broke into his home, terrified when he hid in the closet clutching the satchel while his father was beaten. But he had decided that protecting the evidence and honoring Samuel's sacrifice was more important than his fear. He did not know if that made him brave, but he knew it made him proud. He mounted the bronze plaque on the wall near the entrance, using the tools he had brought, securing it firmly to the stone. The words were simple, in memory of Samuel Whitmore, who gave his life to protect this mountain and its people. May his courage never be forgotten. Ethan stepped back and looked at the plaque, and he felt that something had been completed, a circle closed, a debt repaid. Then he turned and walked out of the cave, emerging into the sunlight of a spring morning, and he stood there for a long moment, letting the warmth wash over him. The mountain rose above him, green and alive and protected forever, and the valley spread below him, the town of Cedar Hollow nestled in its embrace. He was 14 years old now, and the next chapter of his life was waiting to be written. 5 years had passed since the spring, when Ethan placed the plaque in the cave, and the boy who had stumbled upon Samuel Whitmore's remains had grown into a young man standing on the threshold of a new life. Ethan was 18 now, taller than his father, with the same serious eyes that had always made him seem older than his years but now held something else as well, a quiet confidence born of having faced down fear and come through the other side. His acceptance letter to the state university sat on the kitchen table, the words still thrilling every time he read them. A full scholarship to study environmental science, a path that had been shaped by the events of that fateful autumn when he was 13. He would leave Cedar Hollow in the morning, driving the old truck that his father had finally admitted was more Ethan's than his own, heading toward a future that once would have seemed impossible for a boy from a poor family in a forgotten mountain town. The cabin looked different now, not larger or grander but better cared for, the roof patched and the porch rebuilt and a fresh coat of paint on the window frames. The foreclosure notices were a distant memory, the medical bills long since paid. The shadow of financial ruin that had hung over the family, lifted by the compensation from the conservation easement and by something more important, the restoration of hope and purpose that had transformed all of their lives. Thomas Cole walked with a limp now and always would, the shattered leg never fully healing despite the surgeries and the therapy, but he walked with his head high and his eyes clear. He had found new work as a consultant, traveling to small towns throughout Appalachia to help communities protect their land and water from corporations that sought to exploit them. He had become, in his own way, a successor to Samuel Whitmore, using his knowledge of the timber industry and his hard-won understanding of how powerful interests operated to help others avoid the fate that had nearly befallen Cedar Hollow. Mary Cole had finally stopped working double shifts at the diner. She worked 3 days a week now, enough to keep her busy and connected to the community she loved, but she had time to rest, time to tend the garden she had always wanted, time to simply sit on the porch in the evening and watch the light fade over the mountains. The exhaustion that had lined her face for so long had softened, and she smiled more easily now, laughed more readily, looked at her husband and her son with an expression that spoke of gratitude for the life they had built together. On his last night before leaving, Ethan and his father hiked up to the old timber line as the sun began to set. They did not go all the way to the cave, did not need to, but they climbed high enough to find a rocky outcropping where they could sit side by side and look out over the valley below. Cedar Hollow lay spread before them, the houses and the church steeple and the ribbon of the creek catching the golden light, and beyond it the forested slopes of Black Rock Mountain rising green and untouched against the darkening sky. They sat in comfortable silence for a long time, father and son, watching the shadows lengthen and the first stars appear. Then Thomas spoke, his voice rough with emotion he did not try to hide. He told Ethan that he had saved more than this family, that he had saved this whole place, these mountains and these waters, and the people who depended on them. He said that Samuel Whitmore would be proud of the man Ethan had become. Ethan looked at his father, at the lines on his face and the silver in his hair and the strength that had returned to his eyes, and he thought about the journey that had brought them here. He thought about the boy he had been, lonely and afraid and searching for escape, and the man in the cave who had given his life for a principle. He thought about courage and sacrifice, and the choices that define us. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that the mountain would keep its secrets safe, that Samuel Whitmore's legacy would endure, and that whatever challenges lay ahead, he would face them the same way he had faced the darkness of the cave, by deciding that something was more important than fear. The stars brightened overhead, and the valley below faded into shadow, and Ethan Cole sat with his father on the mountain that had shaped them both, ready at last to begin the next chapter of his story.